The moment the doctor stopped talking, I knew this had nothing to do with the cut on my hand. He had been calm up until then, professional, efficient, the kind of man who explained every step while he worked. He stitched my palm without rushing, counted each stitch out loud, and told me I would be sore for a few days. Routine, ordinary, nothing to worry about. But when the lab results came back, his voice vanished. He stood at the foot of my hospital bed staring at the clipboard for too long. His jaw tightened. Then, without saying a word, he turned and walked out of the room. Through the glass panel in the emergency room door, I watched him pull out his phone. He pressed his hand against his forehead like someone trying to solve an impossible equation. I counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3. He paced once, then stopped, speaking quietly into the receiver. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. He didn't come back alone. 3 doctors stepped into that small emergency room, filling the space with a kind of heavy silence I had never felt before. They didn't look at my bandaged hand. They didn't look at my chart. They looked at me. Not with sympathy, not with concern, with disbelief. Like I was standing in front of them when I wasn't supposed to exist at all. At that moment, I understood this was not about an accident. Whatever was in my blood had just changed my life forever. And I had no idea whether I was about to be saved or destroyed. My name is Ava Coleman. I am 35 years old. And 3 months before that night, I was scrubbing hospital floors for minimum wage, invisible to everyone who walked past me. I was wearing my gray janitor uniform when the glass sliced into my hand. The fabric was still stiff with dried disinfectant, my name stitched over the chest in white thread that no one ever read. There was blood on the sleeve now, dark and sticky, soaking through the cotton. I remember thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was that I had once helped design buildings like this one. How I had calculated stress loads and safety margins for structures meant to protect human life. And now here I was, bleeding quietly on a floor I cleaned every night. The nurse who rushed me into the emergency room barely looked at my uniform. She focused on the blood, on the way my hand wouldn't stop shaking. They laid me on the bed, wrapped my palm in gauze, asked me my name. It startled me how much that question mattered. Someone needing to know who I was. The doctor said I had lost more blood than it looked like. He ordered standard tests, just to be safe. He said it the way people say things when they expect nothing unusual, when they assume the world will continue behaving normally. I didn't expect anything either. If I'm honest, part of me hoped they would find something wrong, something final, something that would explain why my life had unraveled so completely in such a short time. At least then there would be a reason, a diagnosis, a sentence with an ending. Instead, there was silence. And then there were questions that made no sense. As the 3 doctors stood around my bed, one of them, a woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, stepped closer. She didn't reach for my chart right away. She studied my face, my posture, the way I was holding myself like someone bracing for impact. "Ms. Coleman," she said gently, "I need to ask you something about your family." I swallowed. My throat was dry. "Was your father adopted?" The question landed wrong. It didn't fit the room, the moment, the blood on my uniform. I nodded slowly. Yes. He was. He had been adopted as an infant. He never talked about it. He always said the past didn't matter. She exchanged a look with the others. That was when the room began to spin. 3 months earlier, my sister had sent me a text message with 2 words attached to a photo of her smiling on a yacht beside my fiancé. Enjoy poverty. Lying there in the emergency room, my hand throbbing, my uniform stained with my own blood, I realized something with terrifying clarity. Poverty was never the real punishment. If I disappeared that night, if I closed my eyes and never opened them again, I wondered who would notice. The hospital would replace me by the next shift. Another woman would push the mop bucket down those same halls. The floors would still shine by morning. The world would move on exactly as it always had. For the past 3 months, I had been living like that, existing in the margins, working night shifts because it was the only job I could get, cleaning bathrooms and hallways while doctors rushed past me without a glance. I learned how to make myself smaller, quieter. How to not flinch when people spoke to me like furniture. I used to be someone. Before everything collapsed, I had a career that meant something. I had opinions people listened to. I had meetings where my voice mattered. I believed that if you worked hard and did the right thing, the world would meet you halfway. That belief didn't survive my family. When the doctor asked me about my father, memories surfaced that I hadn't touched in years. My dad sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee before sunrise. His hands rough, always scarred from work. He never complained. He used to say honest labor had dignity, no matter what uniform you wore. He never searched for his biological parents. He never wanted to know. Maybe he knew something was buried there, or maybe he simply believed blood didn't define worth. The head of genetics pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down. That alone told me this was serious. Doctors don't sit unless they're about to change your life. "We found something unusual in your blood work," she said carefully. "Something rare." I laughed under my breath, a soft, broken sound. Rare felt like a cruel joke. Everything about my life had become painfully ordinary. I was a woman who cleaned floors at night and went home to an apartment that barely fit a bed. There was nothing rare about me. She didn't smile. "These genetic markers," she continued, "they appear in one family. We have only seen them once before in our database." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the mistake. "The Harrington family," she said. The name hit me harder than the pain in my hand. Everyone knew that name. They were the kind of family whose buildings carried their name in glass and steel. Their foundation funded hospitals, universities, research centers. The kind of wealth people whispered about, not because it was flashy, but because it was untouchable. I shook my head. "That's not possible." Her voice didn't change. "Your blood says otherwise." She explained that the chairman of the Harrington family had died recently, that his will specified any biological descendant would inherit everything, that records from decades ago suggested a child had been quietly given up for adoption to protect the family name, a child who grew up believing he was nobody special, a child who became my father. The world tilted. The ceiling lights blurred. I pressed my good hand into the mattress, trying to anchor myself. I didn't think about money. I didn't think about inheritance. I thought about my father dying without ever knowing who he was. I thought about my sister's text message, about the way she smiled when she sent it, about how easily she decided my life was disposable. The doctor was still talking, explaining the need for confirmation, for independent testing, for legal processes. Her words drifted in and out like static. All I could hear was my own heartbeat. 3 months ago, I had been told to enjoy poverty. That night, lying in an emergency room bed, I realized my life hadn't been destroyed by accident. Whatever the doctors were about to confirm wasn't just going to explain my blood, it was going to explain everything. Before everything collapsed, I believed my life was solid. Not perfect, not glamorous, but carefully built, layer by layer, the way you build something meant to last. I believed in structure, in foundations, in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly how much weight something can carry before it fails. That belief defined me long before it betrayed me. For most of my adult life, I was a structural engineer. Not the kind who chased headlines or flashy projects, but the kind trusted with responsibility. Hospitals, research centers, office towers where thousands of people would work without ever thinking about the beams above their heads. I loved that invisibility. I loved knowing that my work mattered even when no one noticed it. I worked for one of the most respected engineering firms in the region. My salary had climbed steadily over the years until it reached a level that surprised even me. I lived comfortably, not extravagantly. I paid my bills on time. I saved. I planned. I believed stability was the greatest luxury a person could have. When people asked what I didn't boast. I just said I made sure buildings stayed standing, and I was proud of that. I was also proud of the life I thought I was building with Evan. We met at a professional networking event years earlier, the kind where everyone pretends they're not sizing each other up. He stood out immediately, confident, polished, effortlessly charming. He had already made his money by then, through investments I didn't fully understand and never felt the need to question. What mattered to me was how he looked at me when I talked about my work. Interested, impressed, like my mind was something valuable. "You're the smart one," he used to say with a smile. "I just move money around." At the time, it felt like respect. We moved in together after 2 years, a house that felt like the beginning of something permanent. We talked about marriage in practical terms, not fairy tales. Joint accounts, timelines, what city we wanted to stay in long term. I liked that we planned instead of fantasized. It made everything feel real. Evan fit easily into my world. He came to company events with me, shook hands with partners, asked the right questions. People liked him, more than liked him. They listened when he spoke. They remembered his name. I noticed it, but I didn't think much of it. Influence never interested me the way competence did. That difference would cost me everything. My sister Emily had always been the complicated part of my life. She was younger than me by a few years, and where I was methodical, she was impulsive. Where I built things slowly, she leaped without looking. Growing up, I protected her, cleaned up after her mistakes, explained them away to our parents. When she struggled to find her footing as an adult, I didn't hesitate to help. When she needed a place to stay, I opened my home. When she bounced between jobs, I helped her polish her resume. When she complained about feeling left behind, I told her she just hadn't found her path yet. I never saw her as competition. She was my sister, blood, family. When Emily started spending more time at our house, I welcomed it. I told myself it was good for her to be around stability, around adults who had things figured out. She and Evan seemed to get along easily, but that didn't bother me. Evan got along with everyone. I trusted them both. That trust was my first mistake. The signs were there, looking back. Small things. Glances that lingered a second too long. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Emily making jokes about money that didn't quite sound like jokes. Evan talking more about influence, about who mattered and who didn't. I dismissed all of it. I was busy, deadlines piled up, projects demanded focus. I spent long hours reviewing calculations, running simulations, checking and rechecking details because people's lives depended on it. When I came home exhausted, I didn't have the energy to analyze body language or hidden motives. I believed that the people closest to me would never hurt me. I believed that love, like engineering, followed rules. Around that time, my work was at its peak. I had just wrapped up a major project under budget and ahead of schedule. My performance reviews used words like reliable and indispensable. Junior engineers came to me for guidance. Managers trusted my judgment. I thought I was safe. That illusion shattered quietly at first. Emails started going unanswered. Meetings I normally attended went on without me. Files were reassigned without explanation. When I asked questions, I got vague responses. "We're restructuring. Things are shifting. Don't worry about it." I told myself it was temporary. Companies change, teams adjust. It had nothing to do with me. At home, Evan was distracted. On his phone more often, stepping outside to take calls, traveling more. Emily seemed restless, edgy in a way I couldn't put my finger on. When I asked if everything was okay, she snapped at me for hovering. I apologized. That night, I came home early with a headache. The house was too quiet. Emily's car was in the driveway, which surprised me, but I didn't think twice about it. I assumed she was waiting for me. I was wrong. I heard laughter from upstairs. Soft, intimate. The kind of laughter you don't share with someone you respect. It stopped me in the hallway. I stood there, my hand on the banister, listening as my sister said something that made my stomach drop. "He has no idea," she said. "She's always buried in her work." I pushed the bedroom door open. The image burned itself into my memory with a clarity I still can't escape. Emily wearing my robe. Evan sitting on the edge of the bed like he belonged there. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She looked at me like I had interrupted her life. Evan sighed. That was the moment something fundamental broke inside me. The confrontation was brief, brutal, and strangely calm. Evan admitted everything without drama. He said the relationship had been over for months. He said feelings change. He said he didn't mean to hurt me. Emily was worse. She told me I had always thought I was better than her, that I cared more about my career than about people, that Evan deserved someone who understood ambition the way he did. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just listened, numb, while the two people I trusted most dismantled my life like it was an inconvenience. When Evan said he wanted to end things officially, I nodded. When Emily told me I should move on gracefully, I walked out of the room. I slept on the couch that night. I left the house the next morning. What I didn't know then was that the betrayal hadn't ended with my heart. It was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, Evan became difficult in a new way. He didn't just disappear from my personal life. He appeared everywhere else, at industry events, in conversations that suddenly mattered. I heard his name mentioned in meetings where it had never been relevant before. Emily, too, seemed to have found confidence overnight. She spoke about projects she had no business understanding. She dropped names casually. She smiled in a way that felt rehearsed. I still didn't connect the dots. I thought I was dealing with heartbreak. I didn't realize I was standing at the edge of something far worse. One afternoon, I was called into a meeting with upper management. No warning, no agenda. Just a calendar invite and a room full of serious faces. They told me my position was being reviewed. They mentioned concerns, vague ones, procedural ones. They said nothing definitive, but their tone had already decided my fate. I walked out of that room unsettled but not afraid. I had built my career on integrity, on competence, on facts. I believed that would protect me. That belief would not survive the next few weeks. By the time I realized what was happening, the story of my life was already being rewritten by people who knew exactly how to erase me. And I was still foolish enough to think the truth would save me. I came home early that night because my head wouldn't stop pounding. It was the kind of headache that makes light feel sharp and sound feel heavy, the kind that tells you to lie down before your body makes the decision for you. I didn't text, I didn't call, I just drove home, thinking about a dark room and silence. The house was quiet when I walked in. Too quiet. Emily's car was parked in the driveway, which caught my attention for half a second. She hadn't mentioned stopping by, but that wasn't unusual. She dropped in often, usually unannounced, usually needing something. I told myself she was probably waiting for me. Maybe she wanted to talk. Maybe she needed advice. I was still in the habit of assuming the best. I set my bag down and kicked off my shoes. That was when I heard her laugh. Not the polite laugh she used around our parents. Not the nervous laugh she used when she was unsure of herself. This one was soft and loose, the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who feels completely safe. It came from upstairs. I froze at the bottom of the stairs, my hand resting on the banister. The sound carried again, followed by Evan's voice, low and familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. They were in our bedroom. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself I was tired, that stress was distorting things. Emily and Evan talked all the time. There was nothing strange about that. Then I heard her say my name. "She has no idea," Emily said, her voice light, almost amused. "She's always buried in her work, blueprints, calculations, deadlines. She wouldn't notice if the house burned down around her." There was a pause. Evan chuckled. Something inside me went cold. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, like my body already knew what my mind was still trying to reject. I stood outside the bedroom door and listened as Emily continued speaking, her words cutting deeper with every sentence. "She thinks everything is stable because she needs it to be. She builds her life like one of her structures, controlled, predictable." I pushed the door open. The room fell silent. Emily was standing near the bed, wearing the robe I had bought for myself last winter. Evan was sitting on the edge of the mattress, his jacket draped over the chair like he planned to stay a while. For a few seconds no one moved. No one apologized. Emily's eyes widened for exactly a heartbeat. Then she straightened her shoulders and crossed her arms. Evan sighed. "How long have you been standing there?" he asked. "Long enough," I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, like it belonged to someone else. Emily tilted her head, studying me. There was no guilt in her expression, only irritation, as if I had walked in on something that belonged to her. "I guess this was bound to happen," she said. That was it. No denial, no tears, no scrambling for excuses. Bound to happen. Evan stood up, smoothing his shirt. He didn't look at me at first. He looked at the floor, then at the window, like he was choosing his words carefully. "We didn't plan it like this," he said. "But things change, Ava. Things change." I waited for anger to hit me, for the urge to scream or throw something or demand an explanation that would never make sense. Instead, I felt hollow, like the air had been sucked out of the room and my chest with it. "How long?" I asked. Emily answered before Evan could. "About 8 months." 8 months. She said it casually, like she was telling me how long she'd been seeing a new trainer at the gym. My knees went weak. I grabbed the doorframe to steady myself. "Why?" I asked. It came out quieter than I expected. Emily rolled her eyes. "Because he's ambitious. Because he wants more. Because he's not content settling." She glanced at Evan, then back at me. "You take him to chain restaurants and talk about stress loads. He takes me to places where people actually matter." Evan didn't argue. He just nodded, as if she had summarized things accurately. "I didn't mean for it to hurt you like this," he said, "but I can't pretend anymore. I'm not in love with you." The words should have shattered me. Instead, they slid past, almost abstract. What hurt wasn't the end of the relationship. It was the way they stood there together, united, like a team that had already moved on. "I want to end things," Evan continued. "Cleanly. I've already spoken to a lawyer." Of course he had. Emily smiled. Not a triumphant smile, something colder. "You'll be fine," she said. "You always land on your feet. You're good at surviving." I realized then that this wasn't just betrayal. It was replacement. Emily wasn't sneaking around behind my back because she had fallen in love. She was stepping into my life piece by piece, and she felt entitled to it. I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't cry that night. I didn't sleep either. I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, replaying moments I had once trusted. Every smile, every shared dinner, every time Emily had thanked me for helping her, every time Evan had praised my intelligence. In the morning, I packed a bag and left. The days that followed blurred together. Evan moved quickly, efficiently, like he did everything. Papers were filed. Accounts were discussed. Boundaries were established. He spoke to me the way people speak when they're already emotionally gone. Emily stopped answering my calls. When I did hear from her, it was in short messages, clipped and distant. She told me she needed space, that things were complicated, that I should respect her choices. Respect. I returned to work and buried myself in projects, grateful for the distraction. For a few hours each day, I could pretend my life hadn't been torn open. I focused on calculations and drawings, on problems with clear solutions. At home, I avoided mirrors. I avoided silence. Evan's presence lingered in ways that felt intentional. His name came up in conversations it hadn't before. People mentioned his investments casually, the way they mention weather. Emily's confidence grew sharper. She talked about connections, about influence, about the way things really worked. I started to sense a shift, but I couldn't define it yet. One evening, I overheard a conversation at a professional mixer. 2 colleagues speaking quietly, unaware I was standing close enough to hear. "Evan Hull's been asking questions," one said, "about certain teams, certain people." The other laughed nervously. He's got opinions. They noticed me then and fell silent. I drove home with my hands clenched around the steering wheel, my thoughts racing. Evan had no reason to ask questions about my work. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't involved in my firm. Unless he wanted to be. The next week, I was removed from a meeting I had led for months. The week after that, a project I had spearheaded was reassigned without explanation. When I asked my manager, he avoided my eyes. "It's just temporary," he said. "Things are shifting." At home, Emily posted photos online, dinners, events. Evan at her side. People congratulated them, made comments about how happy they looked. I scrolled through them with numb detachment, like I was watching strangers. One night, my phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "You need to stop acting like a victim," she wrote. "This is just how life works." I stared at the screen, my chest tight. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about love. This was about power. Evan had resources, influence, access. Emily had learned quickly how to use them. Together, they weren't just walking away from me, they were positioning themselves, and I was in the way. A few days later, Evan called. "I've been talking to some people," he said casually. "There are concerns about your role at the firm." My heart dropped. Concerns? He sighed, like he was tired of explaining things. "Nothing personal, just issues. You should be prepared." Prepared. I hung up the phone, shaking. That night I lay awake replaying everything. The laughter behind the bedroom door. Emily's smile. Evan's calm detachment. The way my work life had begun to fracture at the edges. I finally understood the scope of what they were doing. They hadn't just betrayed me. They were dismantling me, piece by piece. And I was still standing there, clinging to the belief that truth and effort would protect me. I didn't know yet that the worst was still ahead. But I felt it, deep in my bones, like a structure beginning to fail long before it collapses. That night, as I stared into the darkness, one thought kept repeating in my mind. I had lost my fiancé. I had lost my sister. And I was about to lose everything else. For a brief moment after I walked away from Evan and Emily, I believed my career was the one thing they couldn't touch. Work had always been my refuge. No matter what was happening in my personal life, equations stayed honest. Steel behaved the same way every time. Loads followed rules. If something failed, it was because of physics, not betrayal. I told myself I could survive heartbreak as long as I still had that. I was wrong. In the days following the breakup, I forced myself into routine. I woke up early, dressed carefully, and showed up to the office determined not to let anyone see the cracks. I reviewed drawings, answered emails, attended meetings, and spoke with the same calm confidence I always had. I told myself that professionalism was armor, that competence would protect me. At first, nothing dramatic happened. That almost made it worse. It started with small things, subtle things, the kind you question yourself about later. An email chain I was always included on stopped appearing in my inbox. A meeting I normally led was suddenly rescheduled without me. A junior engineer apologized awkwardly when I asked why my name had been removed from a project update. "Must have been a mistake," he said, not meeting my eyes. I told myself it was nothing. But mistakes don't repeat themselves with that kind of precision. Within a week, my calendar looked unfamiliar. Decisions were being made without my input. Files I had worked on for months were reassigned. When I asked my manager for clarification, he smiled tightly and said things were shifting. That upper management wanted to streamline communication. Streamline. Another word that meant nothing and everything at the same time. I started to feel it in the room before anyone said it out loud. Conversations stopped when I approached. People lowered their voices. Colleagues who once relied on my judgment suddenly found reasons not to ask. Isolation has a sound. It's the quiet that follows your name. At home, Evan's shadow was everywhere. Not physically, but socially. His name came up more often than mine at industry events. People spoke about him with a tone that suggested importance, influence. Emily, too, seemed to be everywhere all at once. She attended functions she had never been invited to before. She spoke with confidence she hadn't earned. I began to sense that something was happening behind my back. The first warning came from someone who cared enough to risk their own position. Mitchell had been with the firm almost as long as I had. He was cautious by nature, the kind of man who measured his words twice before speaking. When he asked me to grab coffee after work, I knew it wasn't casual. He waited until we were seated in a quiet corner before leaning in. "You need to be careful," he said. I frowned. "About what?" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There are rumors." My stomach tightened. "Rumors about what?" He shook his head. "About your work, about how you handle projects, about whether you follow procedures." The words didn't make sense. "That's ridiculous. You've seen my work." "I know," he said quickly. "That's why I'm telling you. None of it lines up, but people are talking." "Who?" I asked. Mitchell glanced around the cafe, then back at me. "It's not coming from inside the firm, not originally." That was when the cold realization settled in my chest. Evan. Over the next 2 weeks, the whispers grew louder. Subtle accusations began to surface in meetings, framed as concerns rather than claims. Someone mentioned documentation inconsistencies. Someone else questioned oversight. Each comment was small enough to dismiss, but together they formed a pattern. I requested a formal review. That was my second mistake. The meeting invitation arrived without warning. No agenda, no context. Just a room number and a time. When I walked in, I found 3 people seated at the table. Human resources, legal, senior management. No one smiled. They began by telling me this was routine. That they needed to address certain concerns that had been brought to their attention. They used phrases like risk management and compliance review. Then they slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents I had never seen before, emails with my name on them, sent from my account, authorizing changes I had never approved, reports bearing my digital signature on pages I had never signed, memos suggesting shortcuts I would never take. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. "This isn't real," I said. "These aren't mine." They exchanged looks. "We've verified the metadata," someone said. "The files originated from your credentials." "That's impossible," I said. "I would remember." They didn't argue. They didn't need to. The decision had already been made. They told me the firm could not take the risk of keeping someone whose judgment was in question. They said the matter would be handled quietly, that I would receive severance, that it would be best for everyone if this ended cleanly. Cleanly. I felt like I had been punched in the chest. 15 years of work reduced to a folder of lies and a polite dismissal. "I want a chance to prove this," I said. "Give me time. Let me audit the records." The head of HR avoided my eyes. "The decision has been finalized." Security escorted me to my office. That walk down the hallway is burned into my memory. People I had mentored stood at their desks, pretending to type. Someone looked up, then quickly looked away. I packed my things in silence. Photos, books, a framed certificate I had once been proud of. When I reached the elevator, my hands were numb. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned. The anger came later when I started looking for work. I sent out resumes to every firm within a 100-mile radius, companies I had collaborated with, people who had praised my work publicly. Recruiters who had once called me weekly suddenly had no openings. Polite emails arrived, all saying the same thing in different words. "We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Your qualifications are impressive, but the fit isn't right." Interviews were scheduled and then canceled. Promising conversations went nowhere. Doors closed before I reached them. It didn't take long to understand what was happening. I was being blacklisted. The realization came during a phone call with a recruiter I trusted. She spoke carefully, choosing her words the way people do when they don't want to be quoted. "There are concerns," she said. "Concerns about what?" I asked. She sighed. "Your reputation." My reputation. The thing I had spent my entire career protecting. "Who's saying these things?" I asked. There was a pause. I can't say names, she said, but it's coming from someone with influence, someone people listen to. I hung up the phone and sat in my car, staring at the dashboard until my vision blurred. That was the moment it all clicked into place. Evan hadn't just taken my fiancé role and given it to my sister. He had taken my professional identity and dismantled it with the same efficiency. He knew exactly which strings to pull, which conversations to have, which doubts to plant. Emily had helped, I was certain of it. She knew which stories would hurt me the most, which insecurities to exploit. She had watched me build my career from the inside. Together, they had rewritten the story of my life. I tried to fight back. I consulted a lawyer, brought him the documents, explained the inconsistencies. He listened carefully, then told me the truth. It would take years, he said, and money you don't have. Even if you win, the damage to your reputation might never fully heal. I left his office feeling smaller than I ever had before. Within a month, my savings began to disappear. Mortgage payments, insurance, utilities. The math stopped working no matter how carefully I ran it. I sold things I never thought I would. Jewelry, furniture, books I loved. The house I had planned to grow old in became a burden I could no longer carry. Emily didn't call. Evan didn't text. The silence was intentional. One night, as I sat surrounded by half-packed boxes, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. When I opened it, my breath caught. It was a photo. Emily and Evan standing on a yacht, champagne glasses raised, city lights glowing behind them. They looked effortless, victorious. The caption read, "Enjoy poverty." I stared at those two words for a long time. That message didn't break me. It clarified everything. They hadn't just wanted me gone. They wanted me erased. And as I sat there in the quiet, my career destroyed, my name dragged through rooms I would never enter again, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. I wasn't dealing with heartbreak. I was dealing with a calculated execution of my life. By the time I locked the door behind me for the last time and handed over the keys to a house I could no longer afford, I understood something that would take months to fully sink in. They hadn't walked away from me. They had made sure I had nowhere left to stand. And I was about to find out how far a person can fall when everything they built is taken from them at once. The morning after I handed over my house keys, I woke up with nowhere to go. No office to drive to, no meetings to prepare for, no reason to rush through my coffee. The silence was heavier than anything I had experienced before. It pressed in on me, filling every corner of the small apartment I had moved into the night before. 4 bare walls. A mattress on the floor. 2 boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack. This was what was left of my life. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at my phone, willing it to ring. For years, my mornings had started with emails and messages, people needing answers, decisions waiting for my input. Now there was nothing. No notifications, no urgency, just a blank screen reflecting a woman I barely recognized. Unemployment doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in. It drains meaning from hours that used to be structured, turns days into stretches of waiting that feel endless. I told myself I would treat the job search like a full-time position. I created schedules, lists, goals. By the end of the first week, I had applied to more positions than I could count. Engineering firms, consulting groups, smaller outfits that couldn't afford to be picky. I lowered my expectations with every submission. Senior roles, mid-level roles, positions I was technically overqualified for but willing to take. The responses were polite, efficient, empty. Thank you for your interest. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. We were impressed by your background, but the fit isn't right at this time. We'll keep your resume on file. They all sounded the same, as if they were being generated from a template designed to erase people gently. Interviews that did get scheduled ended quickly. The questions were shallow, the smiles tight, the promises vague. I learned to recognize the moment when something shifted in the room, when the interviewer stopped seeing me as a candidate and started seeing me as a risk. No one ever said it outright. They didn't have to. After one particularly awkward meeting, a hiring manager walked me to the elevator and lowered his voice. "Off the record," he said. "You're impressive, but there are concerns." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I already knew. By the end of the second month, my savings account looked like a countdown timer. Every bill that arrived felt personal. Rent, utilities, insurance, numbers that once barely registered now kept me awake at night. I ran the math again and again, hoping it would change if I stared at it long enough. It never did. I sold my dining table first, then the spare chair, then the watch Evan had given me on our second anniversary. Each sale felt like a small surrender, a quiet admission that the life I had built was gone. I stopped answering calls from friends, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. I didn't have the energy to explain myself, to reassure them that I was fine when I wasn't. I didn't want pity. I didn't want advice. I wanted time to rewind. My mother called every day. She sensed something was wrong even before I admitted it. She asked careful questions, offered vague help, suggested I come stay with her. I refused every time. She was living on a fixed income, her own worries already heavy enough. I couldn't bring myself to become another burden. "I'm managing," I told her. "It's temporary." I said it so often that it almost sounded true. Emily didn't call at all. Her silence was louder than any insult. It told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in her life. Evan's absence was expected. Hers was devastating in a way I hadn't prepared for. Losing a partner hurt. Losing a sister felt like losing a limb. When my lease ended on the house, I packed alone. I wrapped dishes in newspaper. I folded clothes I might never wear again. In the closet, my dress hung untouched, still wrapped in plastic from the last fitting. I stared at it for a long time before shoving it into a box I labeled later. The move to the new apartment happened at night. It felt easier that way, like the darkness could hide what I was doing from the rest of the world. The place was smaller than I expected, older. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbors arguing through them. Sirens wailed constantly, a reminder that safety was relative. The first night there, I slept fully dressed on the mattress, my bag beside me like I might need to leave at any moment. I told myself it was temporary. Temporary became permanent faster than I expected. By the third month, desperation replaced pride. I applied for jobs outside my field, administrative work, retail, cleaning services, anything that didn't require a reference check or an explanation of my past. Most places didn't call back. One did. The hospital position was overnight, cleaning staff, minimum wage, no benefits at first. When the supervisor handed me the uniform, she didn't ask about my background. She didn't care. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like the final proof that I had fallen further than I ever thought possible. The first night I put on that uniform, I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized myself. The gray fabric hung awkwardly, stiff and shapeless. My name was stitched over the chest in block letters, as if that was all I was now. I learned quickly how invisible that uniform made me. Doctors walked past without looking. Nurses issued instructions without acknowledgement. Patients barely noticed me. I became part of the background, something to be navigated around rather than seen. The work was hard, physical in ways my body wasn't used to. My hands cracked from chemicals. My back ached constantly. Still, I showed up, because showing up was the only thing I could control. One night, during a break, my phone buzzed. I hadn't checked my messages in hours. When I pulled it out, my heart sank at the sight of Emily's name on the screen. For a split second, hope flared. Maybe she was reaching out. Maybe she wanted to talk. I opened the message. It was a photo. Emily stood beside Evan on the deck of a yacht, city lights glittering behind them. She wore a white dress that clung to her effortlessly, her hair loose, her smile confident. Evan's arm was around her waist, his expression relaxed, satisfied. They looked like an advertisement for the life I had lost. Below the photo were 2 words: "Enjoy poverty." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked. There's a difference. Breaking is loud, final. Cracking is quiet. It's the sound of something shifting under pressure, preparing to become something else. I didn't respond. I put my phone back in my pocket and went back to work. I finished my shift in silence, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans like the message hadn't just tried to reduce me to nothing. That night, walking home in the early morning light, I realized something important. They wanted me to beg. They wanted me to explain, to justify myself, to prove that I was still worthy of dignity. I refused. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. My body adjusted to the physical strain, but my mind struggled. Every night I replayed conversations, decisions, moments where I might have acted differently. I questioned my instincts, my trust, my understanding of people. I lost weight because I couldn't afford proper meals. I learned how to stretch a few dollars across a week. I learned which grocery stores discounted produce at night, which streets to avoid after dark, how to sleep through noise. I also learned how resilient I was when I had no other choice. There were moments when I considered giving up, moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. I would sit on the edge of my mattress, exhausted, and wonder if this was it, if this was as far as my life would go. And then I would remember my mother's voice, my father's quiet strength. The years I had survived things I thought would destroy me. So I kept going. I worked, I slept, I showed up again. I didn't know how long I could live like that. I didn't know what the future held. All I knew was that I wasn't finished. 3 months earlier, I had been told to enjoy poverty as if it were a sentence, a punishment meant to humble me. What Emily didn't understand was this. Poverty didn't break me. It stripped me down to the core of who I was. And standing there in the quiet of my apartment after another long shift, I made a promise to myself. I didn't know how I would survive. But I knew I would. Because if they wanted to erase me, they would have to do better than that. And I was about to find out just how much endurance I had left. The hospital at night has a different kind of silence. It isn't peaceful, it's hollow. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own thoughts too clearly. The overhead lights hum softly, and the floors reflect everything but your face. I learned the rhythm of that place quickly. Which corridors stayed busy, which wings felt abandoned after midnight, where the smell of disinfectant was strongest. I worked from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. 8 hours of movement meant to keep you from thinking too much. Push the cart, empty the bins, mop the floors, scrub until the shine came back. Repeat. People didn't see me. Doctors passed by with charts tucked under their arms, conversations half finished, eyes fixed on places more important than the woman pushing a yellow mop bucket. Nurses nodded sometimes, more out of habit than recognition. Patients rarely looked up at all. I became part of the building, like the walls or the lights. Invisible, but necessary. At first, the invisibility hurt. It reminded me of everything I had lost. The respect, the authority, the way people once listened when I spoke. Over time, it dulled. There was a strange relief in not being noticed. No expectations, no judgments, just work. I learned to keep my head down. The overnight crew was small, a handful of people who didn't ask questions and didn't offer explanations. We were all there for different reasons, but the reasons didn't matter. Survival leveled everything. There was Marisol, who cleaned the surgical wing and never talked about her life. There was Thomas, who had once owned a restaurant before it closed and took his savings with it. We nodded to each other in passing, a quiet acknowledgement that we were all still standing. I didn't tell anyone what I used to do. When they asked, I said I was between things. That night started like any other. I clocked in, tied my hair back, and checked the assignment board. Emergency department, storage rooms, hallways near radiology. The usual. I grabbed my supplies and started moving. By 1 in the morning, my feet already ached. The floors in the emergency wing took longer than the rest. People came and went constantly. Blood, vomit, spilled coffee. Life at its messiest. I was cleaning near the supply closets when the maintenance request came through. Burned out light fixture in one of the storage rooms. Normally maintenance handled that, but the overnight crew was short. I had replaced bulbs before. It wasn't complicated. I carried the ladder into the narrow room, flicked the switch, and sighed when the light stayed dark. The shelves were stacked high with boxes and spare equipment, the air stale and heavy. I climbed the ladder and reached up, twisting the bulb carefully. It didn't budge. I tried again, applying a little more pressure. The glass felt warm under my fingers. Then it shattered. The sound was sharp and sudden, like a gunshot in a confined space. Pain exploded through my hand as jagged edges sliced into my palm and wrist. For a split second, I didn't feel anything at all. Then the blood came. It poured down my arm, dark against the gray of my uniform, dripping onto the floor in thick drops. My vision blurred. I grabbed a rag from the cart and pressed it against the wound, but it soaked through almost immediately. I tried to step back and lost my balance. The ladder tipped, knocking into the shelf. Boxes crashed down around me, the noise echoing through the corridor. Someone shouted. A nurse rushed in, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. She grabbed my arm, guiding me to sit down, calling for help. I remember her voice sounding far away, like I was underwater. "Stay with me," she said. "Don't look." I looked anyway. My hand was a mess of red and torn skin. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, like the room was tilting. They wheeled me into the emergency department on a gurney, the irony not lost on me. I had cleaned this floor hours earlier. Now I was leaving a trail of blood across it. For the first time in months, people looked at me, not because of who I was, but because I was hurt. They asked my name, my age, if I was allergic to anything. The questions came fast and automatic. A young doctor introduced himself, his voice calm, steady. He examined my hand carefully, his brow furrowing. "You're going to need stitches," he said. "Quite a few." I nodded. Talking felt like too much effort. As he worked, he explained what he was doing, counting the stitches quietly. I focused on his voice, on the way it grounded me. 16 stitches in total. He wrapped my hand and told me I had lost more blood than it looked like. "We're going to run some tests," he said, "just to be safe." I didn't argue. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to the sounds of the emergency room around me. Machines beeping, footsteps, voices rising and falling. It felt strange being on this side of things, being the one people rushed for. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Another part of me felt tired, bone-deep tired, the kind that makes you wonder how much longer you can keep going. They took my blood and left me alone to wait. Time stretched. I thought about my father then, about how he used to tell me that hard times revealed who you really were, about how he never complained, even when his body ached after long shifts. I wondered what he would think if he could see me now, lying in a hospital bed in a janitor's uniform. I wondered if he would be proud. When the doctor came back, something was different. He didn't speak right away. He stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the chart in his hands, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at me, hesitated, and turned toward the door. "I'll be right back," he said. He left without explaining. I watched him through the glass panel, confusion creeping in. He pulled out his phone, ran a hand through his hair, and started talking in a low voice. His posture was tense, like someone delivering bad news. My heart began to race. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When the door opened again, he wasn't alone. 3 doctors entered the room, their presence filling the small space. They stood close together, murmuring quietly before turning their attention to me. Their eyes held something I couldn't name. Not pity, not urgency, disbelief. One of them pulled a chair closer and sat down, her movements deliberate. "Ms. Coleman," she said gently, "we need to ask you a few questions." I swallowed. "Is something wrong?" She exchanged a look with the others before answering. "Not in the way you're thinking," she said. "Your injury is serious but manageable. The concern is something we found in your blood work." My stomach dropped. I braced myself for words like disease or condition or abnormal. I had been waiting for life to deliver another blow. This felt like it. She leaned forward slightly. "Was your father adopted?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said slowly. He was. Why? The room seemed to hold its breath. She nodded, as if confirming something she already suspected. We've identified some rare genetic markers, she continued, markers that don't appear randomly. I felt dizzy again, but this time it wasn't from blood loss. What does that mean? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for my chart, then set it aside, choosing her words carefully. It means, she said, that your blood matches a lineage we are very familiar with. The world tilted. I thought of Emily's message, of her smiling face on that yacht, of the words she had chosen so easily. Enjoy poverty. Lying there, my hand bandaged, my body weak, I realized something with startling clarity. This night was not an accident. Whatever they were about to tell me had been waiting in my blood for decades, hidden beneath a life of work and loss and endurance. A truth buried so deep even my father never knew it existed. The doctor took a slow breath. There's more we need to confirm, she said. But what we're seeing suggests that your family history is not what you've been told. My heart pounded in my chest. For the first time since my life had collapsed, I felt something shift beneath the exhaustion. Not hope, not fear, something heavier, something irreversible. And as the doctors prepared to explain what my blood had revealed, I understood that the woman who had walked into the hospital that night would not be the same woman who walked out. The waiting was worse than the pain. Once the doctors asked their questions and stepped out of the room again, the emergency department seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. Machines still beeped. Footsteps still echoed down the hallway. But inside that small room, time stretched thin, like it was being pulled apart. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my bandaged hand resting on my chest, my fingers still trembling. Every sensation felt amplified. The faint sting where the stitches pulled, the dryness in my mouth, the weight of the blanket pressed against my legs. I had been in hospitals before, as a professional, as a visitor, never like this, never as someone waiting to be told what was wrong with her. My mind immediately went to the darkest places: cancer, a blood disorder, something rare and incurable that would explain the strange looks on the doctors' faces. I had seen those looks before, on other patients, the ones who sensed the truth before it was spoken. Part of me felt almost numb at the thought. Another part felt an odd, guilty relief. If there was something seriously wrong with me, at least it would make sense. At least there would be a reason my life had unraveled so completely. A diagnosis would give shape to the chaos, an explanation I could hold on to. I thought about Emily then, not with anger, not even with sadness, just a quiet, distant awareness. I imagined her phone lighting up with another photo, another celebration, another reminder that she had won. I wondered if she would come to the hospital if she knew I was there. The answer came easily. No, she had already buried me. The door opened briefly and a nurse stepped in to check my vitals. Her movements were gentle, her expression neutral. She didn't say anything about my blood work. She didn't say anything at all beyond asking how I felt. I'm okay, I said automatically. It was a lie, but a familiar one. After she left, the silence returned. Minutes passed, then more. I tried to focus on my breathing, but my thoughts kept drifting back to my father, to the strange question the doctor had asked about his adoption. It replayed in my mind, over and over like a puzzle piece that didn't belong to the picture. Why would that matter? My father had been a steel worker, a quiet man who lived simply and died believing he was exactly who he was supposed to be. There was nothing mysterious about him, no secrets, no unanswered questions. At least that was what I had always believed. I remembered the way he used to come home from work, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, his hands rough from decades of labor. He never complained, never spoke about wanting more. He used to say that life wasn't about chasing greatness. It was about doing your part well and going home with a clear conscience. If he had known something was hidden in his blood, he never would have told anyone. Not out of shame, but because it wouldn't have mattered to him. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine his voice telling me everything would be okay. It didn't help. The waiting stretched on long enough for fear to turn into something sharper. Anxiety mixed with resentment. I was tired of being blindsided, tired of discovering too late that my life had been altered without my consent. I had lost my sister, lost my fiancé, lost my career, lost my home. I didn't have anything left to lose. That realization frightened me more than any diagnosis could have. When the door finally opened again, my heart jumped. The young doctor returned first. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see tension in his jaw. He didn't meet my eyes right away. He glanced back into the hallway, then stepped aside. 2 more doctors followed him in, and then another. They filled the room, standing close together, their presence unmistakably deliberate. One of them pulled a chair closer to my bed again and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at me directly, not like a patient, like a person. "Ms. Coleman," she said softly, "thank you for your patience." That alone told me something was wrong. Doctors don't thank you for patience unless you've been waiting for something significant. "I need to be very clear," she continued. "What we're about to discuss is not a diagnosis of illness." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "But it is serious," she added. My pulse quickened. She explained that the hospital had flagged my blood work because of a combination of genetic markers that almost never appeared together. Markers that, on their own, meant very little. Together they meant something else entirely. I listened, but the words felt slippery, hard to hold on to. She spoke about databases, about long-term research, about certain families whose medical records were tracked across generations due to their extensive involvement in healthcare funding and research. That was when the unease deepened. "Why would my blood be in any database like that?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked another question. "Did your father ever talk about his biological parents?" "No," I said. "He didn't know them. He didn't want to." She nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. "Adoption records from that period were often sealed," she said, "especially in certain circumstances." "What circumstances?" I asked. She took a breath. "Circumstances involving money, influence, reputation." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, the kind that precedes a headache or tears or both. My body was already exhausted, my defenses worn thin. I didn't have the energy to brace myself for whatever was coming next. "I don't understand," I said. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," she said carefully, "your genetic profile matches one we have only seen documented once before." I stared at her, my mind racing. "What profile?" I asked. She glanced at the other doctors, then back at me. "A lineage associated with the Harrington family." The name landed in the room with a weight I couldn't immediately process. Harrington. I had heard it before. Everyone had. It was a name attached to buildings, foundations, scholarships. A name people spoke with a mix of admiration and distance. The kind of family you read about, not the kind you ever expected to intersect with your life. "That's not possible," I said automatically. She didn't flinch. "I understand why you'd think that," she said, "but the data is very clear." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She explained that the Harrington family had funded significant portions of the hospital's genetics research for decades, that as part of those contributions, detailed medical profiles were maintained for direct descendants, primarily to track hereditary conditions. "These profiles are not public," she said. "They're highly restricted." I swallowed. "And mine matches one of them?" I asked. She nodded. "Not just matches," she said. "Aligns in a way that suggests direct biological descent." The room felt suddenly too small. I thought of my father again, of his simple life, of the way he used to laugh quietly at stories about wealthy families and powerful people, shaking his head like they belonged to a different universe. He had never known. I was certain of that now. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means," she said, "that the man who raised you was very likely the biological son of someone connected to that family." My chest tightened. "Likely?" I said. "Or certain?" She held my gaze. "We can't say certain yet," she said. "Not without independent confirmation. DNA testing, legal verification, all of that takes time." Time. The word felt surreal. Time had been nothing but an enemy for months. Every delay had cost me something. Every pause had pushed me further from the life I once knew. "And if it's confirmed?" I asked. She hesitated just for a moment. "Then it would mean your family history is not what you've been told," she said, "and that there may be legal implications." Legal implications. My mind struggled to catch up. I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about inheritance. I was thinking about my father working himself into an early grave without ever knowing the truth about who he was. I was thinking about my sister telling me to enjoy poverty. I was thinking about how cruelly ironic life could be. The doctors explained the next steps: additional blood samples, independent labs, confidentiality agreements. They spoke calmly, methodically, like people accustomed to delivering complicated information to overwhelmed minds. I nodded through it all, though I absorbed very little. When they finally left me alone again, the room felt emptier than before. I lay there in the dim light, my thoughts spinning. Nothing had changed yet. I was still broke, still unemployed, still cleaning floors at night to survive, still alone. And yet something fundamental had shifted, not because of what I had gained, but because of what might be true. I thought about Emily's face if she knew I was lying in a hospital bed being asked about my bloodline. I thought about Evan's calm certainty when he told me I wasn't ambitious enough. They had built their victory on the assumption that I was nothing. That assumption was about to be tested. As the hours crept toward morning and the hospital began to wake, one truth settled deep in my chest. Whatever was buried in my blood had waited decades to be found. It had survived adoption, poverty, betrayal, erasure. And now it was awake. I didn't know yet whether it would save me or destroy me. All I knew was this: the story I thought I was living was not the story I had been born into, and the next revelation was going to change everything. The silence after the doctors left felt heavier than anything they had said. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my hand wrapped in fresh bandages, my pulse still racing. The emergency room lights hummed softly above me, indifferent to the fact that my entire understanding of myself had just been shaken loose. I had spent months learning how to survive without hope. Now hope was circling me cautiously, and it frightened me more than despair ever had. I tried to sleep. My body needed it. Blood loss, shock, exhaustion. But my mind refused to rest. My father's face kept appearing in my thoughts. Not as he was at the end, pale and still in the hospital bed, but as he had been when I was young. Sitting at the kitchen table before dawn, drinking his coffee in silence. His lunch pail by his feet. His hands scarred and steady. Was there something he never told me? The idea felt wrong, not because it was impossible, but because it clashed with everything I believed about him. He wasn't a man who hid things. He didn't manipulate or posture. He lived simply because simplicity made sense to him. If he had known something extraordinary about his origins, he would have shrugged it off as irrelevant. Blood didn't impress him. Work did. Character did. That was the man who raised me. A nurse came in quietly and checked my IV. She smiled politely, the way people do when they don't want to intrude. I wanted to ask her what the doctors were saying in the hallway, what words were being whispered about me outside this room, but I stayed silent. I had learned the value of listening. After a while, the head of genetics returned alone. She closed the door behind her gently and pulled the chair close again. The way she sat told me this wasn't a casual follow-up. This was the part people remembered. "I want to be very careful here," she said, "and very clear." I nodded. "We ran your blood through multiple systems," she continued. "Not because we suspected anything unusual about you personally, but because certain markers triggered automatic flags. These markers are extremely rare, Ms. Coleman. They don't appear in the general population." My mouth felt dry. "How rare?" "In our records," she said, "we have only one documented family with this exact combination." She let the words settle. "The Harrington family." I had heard that name my entire life without ever really thinking about it. It was just part of the landscape, like a river or a skyline. Harrington Medical Center, Harrington Scholarships, Harrington Research Grants. They were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Wealth so established it didn't need to announce itself. I shook my head slowly. "There has to be some mistake." She didn't argue. "That's why we're not making any official declarations? Yet. But there's more." She explained that the chairman of the Harrington family had passed away recently at the age of 94, that his death had set a series of legal processes in motion, including a review of his estate and any potential biological heirs. "He had no publicly acknowledged descendants," she said, "at least none that survived him." My heart thudded painfully in my chest. "According to the records," she continued, "his only son died decades ago. No children. That's what the world believes." The room felt smaller with every word. "But," she said gently, "the records we've accessed suggest otherwise." She told me about a sealed adoption in the early 1950s, a male infant born to a woman employed at a Harrington property, a child quietly placed through a private agency, paperwork handled by people with influence, no names, no follow-up, just a transfer designed to disappear. My hands started shaking. "That child," she said, "would be the right age to be your father." I closed my eyes. My father, who worked in a steel mill his entire life. My father, who died believing he was exactly who he was meant to be. My father, who never knew. "There's no indication he was ever informed," she added, as if reading my thoughts. "If this is correct, he lived and died without knowing his biological origins." A sharp ache spread through my chest, unexpected and intense. I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about injustice, about a man who worked until his body gave out, never once suspecting that the world he labored to build had already been built for him and then taken away before he could even see it. "How can you be sure?" I asked quietly. "We can't be," she said. "Not yet. That's why we need independent confirmation, multiple DNA tests, legal verification, chain of custody, everything done by the book." I laughed softly. A hollow sound. "By the book," I repeated. My life had been destroyed by forged documents and whispered lies. Now the truth demanded paperwork. She looked at me with something like sympathy. "I know this is overwhelming." Overwhelming didn't begin to cover it. I thought about Emily again, about the smug certainty in her eyes, about the message she sent me while I was scrubbing floors for a living. Enjoy poverty. The irony pressed down on me so hard I almost laughed again. "What happens if it's confirmed?" I asked. She hesitated. "Then you would be considered a biological descendant of the Harrington family. Legally." "Legally." "And the estate?" I asked. She chose her words carefully. "The estate was structured to pass to any surviving biological heir. If none were found, it would be distributed through charitable foundations." "And if one is found?" I asked. "Then that heir inherits everything." The room went quiet. I stared at her, my mind refusing to accept the scale of what she was saying. Everything. The word felt obscene. I had been counting dollars at the grocery store, deciding which meals I could afford to skip. Everything existed in a universe so far removed from my reality, it might as well have been fiction. I don't want to assume anything, she added quickly. This process takes time, and scrutiny. There will be resistance. From who? I asked. From anyone who benefits from the estate remaining undistributed, she said. From institutions, from people who don't want a surprise heir emerging. I nodded slowly. Of course they wouldn't. She explained the next steps. Blood samples sent to independent laboratories, legal counsel, confidentiality. My head spun as she spoke, but one thing became clear. This was no longer just a medical curiosity. This was a battle. After she left, I lay back and closed my eyes, exhausted beyond words. I didn't sleep so much as drift, my thoughts looping between past and present. I saw my father again, this time in his work boots, laughing quietly as he fixed something around the house. I saw Emily at my kitchen table years ago, crying about feeling lost, about not knowing who she was supposed to be. I saw Evan standing in our bedroom, confident and dismissive, telling me I wasn't ambitious enough. Ambition. They thought ambition meant money, power, proximity to influence. They never understood what ambition had always meant to me. I wanted stability, integrity, a life that made sense when I looked back on it. At some point the sun began to rise. Pale light crept through the small window, softening the edges of the room. A nurse came in with discharge papers and instructions. My hand throbbed, but the pain felt distant now. I changed back into my uniform slowly, methodically. The gray fabric felt heavier than it had the night before. Not because it was dirty, but because it now carried the weight of a before. As I walked out of the hospital, the cool morning air hit my face. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing deeply, watching the city wake up around me. Commuters hurried past, unaware that my world had just tilted on its axis. Nothing had changed yet. I was still broke, still a night shift janitor, still invisible to most of the world. But something inside me had shifted, not into excitement, into clarity. If this was true, then my father had been erased once before I was ever born. And I had been erased again, deliberately, by people who thought I was nothing. That pattern ended with me. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how ugly the legal fight would become. I didn't know how many people would try to discredit me, silence me, make me disappear quietly. But I knew this. For the first time in months, I wasn't standing on nothing. I was standing on truth. And truth, I had learned the hard way, was far more dangerous to my enemies than anger ever could be. 3 months ago, my sister told me to enjoy poverty. That morning, walking away from the hospital with my hand stitched and my heart racing, I understood something she never would. Poverty had never been my inheritance. The real inheritance was waiting, and the world was about to find out who I really was. The morning after I left the hospital, the world looked exactly the same. Cars still lined the streets. Coffee shops still opened their doors. People rushed to work with phones pressed to their ears, lives moving forward without hesitation. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought nothing had changed at all. But everything had. I walked home slowly, my bandaged hand tucked against my chest, my mind replaying every word the doctors had said. By the time I reached my apartment, exhaustion settled into my bones. I slept for a few hours, the kind of shallow sleep filled with half-formed dreams and fragments of memory. When I woke up, my phone was buzzing. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. The number was unfamiliar. "This is Daniel Harris," the voice said when I picked up. "I'm calling from the hospital's legal department." My stomach tightened. He explained that due to the sensitivity of what had been discovered, the hospital was required to notify its legal counsel. "Not to alarm me," he said. "Just protocol." He spoke carefully, every sentence polished. "We strongly recommend you consult an attorney of your own," he said. "Immediately." That word echoed in my head. Immediately. Within hours, my quiet, invisible life was no longer mine alone. I met with a lawyer that afternoon, someone recommended through a chain of cautious suggestions. His office was modest. No grand views, no flashy decor. That alone made me trust him more. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything. My father's adoption, the blood work, the Harrington name, the possibility, however remote, that I was connected to one of the wealthiest families in the country. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "If you're wrong," he said, "this will destroy what's left of your reputation." I nodded. "I know." "And if you're right," he continued, "people with enormous resources will try to discredit you. Quietly if possible, loudly if necessary." I nodded again. He didn't sugarcoat it. DNA testing would need to be done independently. Multiple labs. Chain of custody documentation. Every step verified. Adoption records traced. This wasn't about truth alone. It was about proving truth in a way no one could undo. "You're not fighting for money," he said finally. "You're fighting for legitimacy." That word stayed with me. Legitimacy. For the next few weeks, my life became a strange double existence. By night, I cleaned hospital floors like nothing had changed. By day, I sat in quiet offices signing consent forms, giving blood samples, answering questions about a past I barely knew. No one celebrated. No one congratulated me. Everything was confidential, deliberate, controlled. I went back to work after my stitches healed, slipping into my uniform as if it were armor. The mop bucket didn't care what might be flowing through my veins. The floors still needed cleaning. Part of me clung to that normalcy. The first DNA results came back inconclusive. Not wrong, not right, just incomplete. The second round took longer. I spent those days in a constant state of tension, waiting for a call that could either confirm everything or end it before it began. My lawyer warned me not to tell anyone, not friends, not family, especially not Emily. It was during that waiting period that the first article appeared. Not naming me, not directly, just a brief mention buried deep in a financial blog. A speculative piece about the Harrington estate and the possibility of a previously unknown heir. The tone was dismissive, almost mocking. "A rumor," it said, "an unlikely claim." My lawyer called me as soon as it was published. "They're testing the waters," he said, "seeing how the idea plays publicly." I felt exposed, even though my name wasn't attached. Days later, another article followed, this one less skeptical, more curious, still anonymous, still vague. I stopped reading after the third mention. The pressure mounted quickly. My lawyer's phone rang constantly, requests for comment, quiet inquiries from firms I had never heard of, institutions suddenly very interested in my existence. At the same time, the Harrington legal team made their move. They didn't contact me directly. They contacted my lawyer. A formal letter. Polite, firm, expressing concern about the integrity of any claims being made, requesting full transparency, questioning the validity of preliminary findings. They wanted to control the narrative. My lawyer warned me that this phase was the most dangerous. "They're not attacking you yet," he said. "They're watching, waiting for a weakness." The third DNA test arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I remember the time exactly because my phone buzzed while I was sitting on the edge of my mattress, tying my work shoes. I didn't answer right away. My hands were shaking too badly. When I finally picked up, my lawyer didn't waste time. "It's a match," he said. The room seemed to tilt. "Not partial," he continued, "not circumstantial, full alignment. You are biologically connected to the Harrington bloodline." I sat down slowly. He explained that independent genealogists had traced the adoption records, a private agency, payments made through intermediaries, dates that lined up perfectly with my father's birth. Everything that had been hidden had left a paper trail, and now it was being pulled into the light. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just closed my eyes and pictured my father's face. "They're going to fight this," my lawyer said. "Hard." "I know," I replied. Within days, the Harrington legal team formally contested the claim. Statements were released questioning motives, suggesting opportunism, painting the image of an unknown woman emerging from nowhere with an extraordinary story. I recognized the tactic. Discredit first, dehumanize second. The media picked up the story quickly after that. My name appeared for the first time, alongside photos taken without my consent, old records dredged up, my divorce, my job loss, my current employment, janitor turned heir. The framing was cruel in its simplicity. Some comments were supportive, most were skeptical, a few were outright vicious. I stopped reading them entirely. The court proceedings moved faster than I expected. This wasn't a typical inheritance dispute. The will was explicit. Any biological descendant inherited everything. There was no ambiguity, only verification. The hearing itself was anticlimactic. No dramatic speeches, no gasps from the gallery, just lawyers presenting evidence and judges reviewing documentation. My lawyer spoke when necessary. I answered questions when asked. I wore a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit. Across the room, representatives of the Harrington Foundation avoided my eyes. When the judge delivered the ruling, his voice was calm and precise. The court recognized me as a legitimate biological descendant. Not yet the final distribution. That would come later. But my status was confirmed. Publicly, legally. I walked out of the courtroom alone. No family waited for me. No friends. Just cameras and microphones shoved forward by people who didn't care about the human cost of what they were witnessing. I said nothing. That silence said more than any statement ever could. That evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't need to check the number to know who it was. Emily. The message was short. We need to talk. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I locked my phone and set it face down on the table. For months, I had been erased, ignored, treated as disposable. Now that the truth was public, suddenly I was worth acknowledging again. I didn't respond. That night, lying in bed, I felt an unfamiliar emptiness settle over me. Not sadness, not triumph. Something quieter. I had won a battle, but the war wasn't over. Money hadn't changed hands yet. Power hadn't shifted fully, but the axis of my life had moved, irrevocably. I thought about Emily and Evan, somewhere out there watching the same headlines I was, reading the same words, feeling the same ground shift beneath their feet. For the first time since everything began, I allowed myself a single, steady thought. They had ignored me when I was nothing. Now that the truth was undeniable, they remembered my name. And I was finally in a position to decide what came next. The world learned my name faster than I did. By the time I woke up the morning after the court ruling, it was everywhere. Headlines, push notifications, morning shows speculating about what kind of person I was, what kind of person I would become. They talked about numbers like they were weather forecasts, abstract and impersonal, as if those figures hadn't detonated inside a real human life. I lay in my narrow bed listening to my phone vibrate non-stop on the table beside me. I didn't answer it. I showered, dressed, and went to work. The hospital hallway looked the same as it always had. The same scuffed floors, the same chemical smell, the same early morning rush of staff who moved around me without seeing me. I tied my apron, grabbed my cart, and pushed it forward like I had every night for months. Nothing about my surroundings acknowledged what had just happened, and somehow that grounded me. I mopped the radiology corridor in silence, my mind oddly calm. The court ruling had confirmed what my blood already knew, but it hadn't handed me a new life yet. No money had changed hands, no doors had opened automatically. I was still exactly where I had been the night before. That mattered, because it reminded me that power doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in quietly, waiting to see what you'll do with it. By mid-morning, my phone had accumulated more missed calls than I had received in the last year combined. Numbers I didn't recognize, voicemails I didn't listen to, messages marked urgent by people who had never cared about my urgency before. When I finally clocked out and stepped outside, the city felt louder, more alert, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. I walked home instead of taking the bus, needing the movement, the physical reminder that I still occupied my body, that my feet still touched the ground. When I reached my apartment, I sat at the small table and began listening to the voicemails. The first was from a former colleague. His voice sounded cheerful, almost relieved. "Ava, I just wanted to say how incredible this is. We always knew you were special. If you're ever interested in reconnecting, I'd love to talk." The second was from a recruiter who had stopped returning my calls months earlier. "Circumstances have changed," she said brightly. "There are some opportunities that might be a perfect fit now." I deleted both messages without responding. Then came the one from Emily. She didn't leave a voicemail, just a text. I didn't recognize her number at first. When I opened the message, my chest tightened. "I'm so glad the truth is finally out. I've been worried about you. Can we meet?" Worried. I stared at the word until it lost its meaning. Evan reached out too, more carefully. An email, not a call, long, polite, filled with phrases like misunderstandings and difficult times. He didn't apologize. He framed everything as unfortunate circumstances that had gotten out of hand. I didn't reply to him either. For the first time since my life collapsed, I wasn't reacting. I was observing. And what I observed was fear. Not the loud kind, the quiet, strategic kind. The kind that shows up when people realize the ground beneath them is no longer solid. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself. Messages from people who had gone silent. Invitations that would have thrilled me once. Offers of help that arrived far too late. I answered none of them. Instead, I met with my lawyer. He had laid out the next steps clearly. The court had recognized my status, but the estate itself was still in transition. Trustees, timelines, filings. It would take weeks, possibly months, before anything was finalized. "You need to think carefully about how you want to move," he said. "Everything you do now will be scrutinized." I nodded. I had been scrutinized my entire life. This was nothing new. "What about Evan?" I asked. "And my sister?" He leaned back in his chair. "That depends. Do you want to pursue anything?" The question hung in the air. I thought about forged documents, about whispered conversations, about how easily my career had been dismantled, how deliberately I had been erased. "I don't want revenge," I said slowly. "I want the truth documented." He smiled faintly. "That's usually more effective." We discussed options, quiet investigations, financial records, employment interference, the kinds of things that left trails no amount of influence could completely hide. I didn't sign anything that day. I wanted to be sure. That evening I returned to the hospital, not for work, but to walk the halls one last time before my scheduled shift ended the following week. I moved through the corridors without a cart, without a uniform, just another person blending into the background. I stopped outside the storage room where the light bulb had shattered in my hand. The door was closed now, the shelf repaired, the floor spotless. If that accident hadn't happened, none of this would have come to light. I thought about how easily a life could pivot on a single moment, how many truths waited beneath the surface unclaimed. As I stood there, my phone buzzed again. Emily. This time she didn't ask. "We should talk. It's important." I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just clarity. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because they had miscalculated. They thought I would disappear quietly, that my life would collapse in a way that required no cleanup. They were wrong. When I got home, I sat at the table and opened a blank notebook. I wrote down everything I remembered. Dates, conversations, emails that had felt off. Names of people who had stopped returning my calls at the same time Evan started appearing at industry events. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I documented. The act felt grounding, almost meditative. Each line was a reclaiming of something that had been taken from me. This was what power felt like. Not the ability to destroy someone with a word, but the ability to stay quiet while the truth assembled itself. By the end of the week, the signs of panic on the other side were unmistakable. Emily posted vague messages online about betrayal and misinformation, about how narratives could be twisted. The comments beneath her posts were cautious, confused. No one rushed to defend her the way they once had. Evan's business hit turbulence, not public yet, but visible to those who knew where to look. Meetings postponed, deals delayed, people asking questions he wasn't used to answering. I watched it all from a distance. I didn't interfere. I didn't respond. I finished my final night shift at the hospital quietly. Marisol hugged me without asking questions. Thomas nodded, understanding without words. I turned in my badge and uniform and walked out without ceremony. For months, I had survived by showing up and doing the work no one wanted to see. Now I was stepping into a different kind of work, one that required patience, precision, and restraint. That night, lying in bed, I allowed myself to acknowledge something I hadn't yet admitted. I could destroy them if I wanted to. With one phone call, one public statement, one aggressive move, I could end what was left of their carefully curated lives. But destruction wasn't my goal. Correction was. They had rewritten my story without my consent. Now the truth was rewriting theirs. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to let the evidence speak. As sleep finally claimed me, one thought settled into place, calm and unshakable. They believed the worst thing I could do was take their money. They had no idea. I was about to take their lies. And when the truth finished its work, there would be nothing left for them to hide behind. The first report arrived on a quiet Monday morning. No envelope stamped confidential, no dramatic delivery. Just an email from my lawyer with a subject line that read, "Preliminary findings." I sat at the small kitchen table in my apartment, the same one where I had once counted coins to pay rent, and opened it with steady hands. I didn't feel excitement, I felt recognition. The document was thorough, calm, methodical, exactly what I had asked for. No accusations, no emotional language, just timelines and facts laid out in a way that made everything finally make sense. Emails traced back to their origin servers, digital signatures examined and flagged as manipulated. Metadata that told a story no one had bothered to read until now. The story of how my career had been dismantled wasn't chaotic, it was engineered. I read slowly, taking breaks when my chest felt tight. Not from anger, but from the weight of confirmation. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't overreacted. What had happened to me wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a coordinated effort. The second report focused on Evan. His name appeared over and over, connected to phone calls and meetings that coincided perfectly with the timeline of my professional collapse. He hadn't needed to threaten anyone. He hadn't needed to put anything in writing that could be traced easily. He had simply implied, suggested, asked the right questions in the right rooms. He had positioned himself as a concerned partner, quietly questioning my reliability, my focus, my judgment. He had framed his interference as care, as worry, as someone trying to protect investments and reputations. People listened, they always had. The report detailed how my access credentials had been compromised, how files had been altered from locations that could not have been mine, how internal reviews had been influenced by outside context provided by someone with social leverage. Evan had never touched my work directly. He had touched the people who judged it. When I finished reading, I closed my laptop and sat in silence. The apartment felt different now. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the air no longer carried doubt. Truth has weight. It settles. Emily's report came next. I almost skipped it. Part of me wanted to preserve whatever distance I had created between myself and the version of her that had betrayed me, but avoiding the truth had never protected me before. I opened the file. Her involvement was smaller, but more personal. She had confirmed rumors when asked. Not initiated them, but validated them. She had repeated lies she knew would hurt me because she knew where to place the knife. She had shared private conversations, expressed concern about my emotional stability during a breakup she had caused. She hadn't needed to fabricate evidence. She had been the evidence. Reading that hurt more than anything else, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I had spent months trying not to believe. My sister hadn't just betrayed me in private, she had helped dismantle me in public. When the media picked up the investigation, it didn't come from me. It came from filings. Legal documents don't shout, they don't embellish. They simply exist, and in doing so, They force everyone else to respond. Reporters began connecting dots they hadn't bothered to connect before. Articles shifted tone. Words like alleged started appearing next to Evan's name. Questions followed. Investors grew cautious. Partners delayed meetings. Boards requested explanations. Evan responded the way people like him always do, carefully. He issued statements through representatives, denied wrongdoing without denying facts, framed everything as misunderstandings fueled by timing and stress. He didn't apologize. He didn't take responsibility. He simply tried to outlast the scrutiny. It didn't work. The evidence didn't care about his confidence. Within weeks, his largest partnership was suspended pending review. A routine audit uncovered irregularities unrelated to me, but long ignored because of his reputation. The same influence that had protected him for years now worked against him. People started asking questions he couldn't redirect. Emily tried a different approach. She went public, not with details, with emotion. She posted long messages about family betrayal, about how stories could be twisted when money was involved. She didn't name me directly at first. She didn't have to. The comments did it for her. Some defended her. Most were confused. A few were skeptical. As more information surfaced, that skepticism grew. Friends she once leaned on stopped commenting. Invitations slowed. The social world she had so carefully curated began to close its doors, quietly and without drama. She called me, not once, not twice. Every time I saw her name on my phone, I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just distance. Evan sent a letter, an actual letter, delivered to my lawyer's office. Pages long, carefully worded. He acknowledged mistakes in judgment. He expressed regret for how things had escalated. He suggested mediation. He did not admit to sabotaging my career. He did not apologize. I didn't respond. There was no need. The most powerful thing I had learned over the past year was this: silence is not weakness when the truth is speaking for you. As the investigations deepened, the consequences became unavoidable. Evan's remaining ventures began to unravel under scrutiny. Nothing spectacular. No headlines screaming scandal, just contracts not renewed. Deals quietly abandoned. Trust evaporating one meeting at a time. Emily lost her job shortly after. Officially, it was a restructuring. Unofficially, it was reputational risk. Companies don't like being associated with unresolved controversy, especially when it involves family betrayal and false testimony. She moved out of the apartment she shared with Evan within the month. I heard about it through someone else. I didn't ask. The strangest part of watching all of this unfold was how little satisfaction it brought me. I had imagined once that seeing them fall would feel like justice, like balance restored. It didn't. It felt like closure, and closure is quiet. One evening, as the sun dipped low outside my window, I realized I hadn't thought about revenge in weeks. Not actively, not consciously. My energy had shifted somewhere else, somewhere calmer. I was no longer trying to prove anything. I was simply allowing reality to catch up. My lawyer called with the final update late one afternoon. "They've agreed to a settlement," he said. "No admission of guilt, but substantial penalties. Professional consequences, financial ones." I thanked him and ended the call. That was it. No courtroom confrontation, no dramatic confession. Just accountability delivered in the only language that mattered to them. I sat alone at the table that night, the city humming outside, and let myself feel the weight lift. Not all at once. Gradually. Like pressure easing after being held too long. I thought about my father again, about the way he used to say that character wasn't about what you got away with, but what you could live with. He had believed in consequences, not revenge. In dignity, not dominance. I understood him better now. Emily sent one last message. "I'm sorry. I didn't think it would go this far." I read it once. Then I deleted it. Not because I hated her, but because I no longer needed her words to move forward. Forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's about release, about deciding that someone no longer has a role in your story. I slept deeply that night for the first time in months. When I woke up, the world felt lighter. Not because I had won, but because the chapter that had consumed so much of my life was finally closed. They had taken my past. They had failed to take my future. And as the truth finished speaking, louder than I ever had, I understood something simple and profound. I didn't destroy them. I survived them. And that, in the end, was more powerful than anything they had ever tried to take from me. When the noise finally faded, I was still standing. No cameras followed me anymore. No reporters waited outside my door. The headlines moved on to newer scandals, newer curiosities. The world has a short attention span, and I was grateful for that. Silence returned the way it always does, slowly at first, then all at once. I woke up one morning and realized I didn't feel braced for impact anymore. For months, my body had lived in a constant state of readiness, like I was waiting for another blow, another betrayal, another letter that would undo whatever fragile stability I had managed to build. That morning, there was none of that. Just sunlight through the window and the ordinary hum of the city waking up. Ordinary felt like a gift. People assumed that when the legal dust settled and the estate was finalized, my life must have exploded into something unrecognizable. Mansions, cars, parties, a dramatic transformation. That's the version they expect, because it makes the story easier to digest. The truth was quieter. I moved out of my apartment and into a modest house on the edge of town. Nothing extravagant. 4 bedrooms, a small yard, enough space to breathe. I chose it because it felt solid, not because it impressed anyone. I wanted walls that didn't echo with my own thoughts. I wanted a place that felt like a beginning, not a trophy. Money didn't rush into my life the way people imagine it does. It arrived in statements and meetings and careful planning, numbers on screens, decisions that carried weight. I hired people to help me manage it because I respected what it represented and what it could destroy if handled carelessly. I didn't buy things to prove I had arrived. I bought time. Time to think, time to rest. Time to decide who I wanted to be without the pressure of survival pressing against my ribs every moment of the day. The first place I returned to wasn't a bank or a boardroom, it was the hospital. Philadelphia General hadn't changed. The same hallways, the same scent of disinfectant, the same quiet urgency that never really slept. I walked in through the front doors, not in a uniform this time, but without ceremony. I didn't announce myself. I didn't want to. I asked to see the emergency department. The young doctor who stitched my hand that night recognized me immediately. His face registered surprise, then something like relief. I almost didn't order those extra tests, he admitted quietly as we sat in a small office away from the noise. Something told me not to rush. I thanked him, not for changing my life, for doing his job with care. I made a donation to the hospital that day, a significant one, enough to fund a new wing focused on nursing education and patient care. I insisted it be named after my mother, the Dorothy Coleman Center for Nursing Excellence. When she saw her name on the plans, she cried in a way I had never seen before. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears sliding down her cheeks as she held my hand like she was afraid I might disappear again. She moved into a cottage nearby soon after, a small place with a garden she tended every morning. I visit her every Sunday for dinner. She cooks too much food and asks too many questions, and I let her because I almost lost that too. Some days we talk about my father. She tells me stories I never heard before, about the way he laughed when he was tired, about the pride he took in honest work, no matter how small it seemed to others, about how he would have hated the idea of being important just because of a name. I understand him now in a way I never could before. He didn't need to know where he came from to live with integrity. He chose it every day without permission or reward. That was his inheritance to me. I donated money quietly after that, to education programs, to workforce training, to funds that supported people working night shifts, cleaning buildings, doing the jobs no one notices until they stop being done. I never attached my name. I didn't need to. I knew exactly who I was helping because I had been one of them. People sometimes ask if I ever think about Emily and Evan. The honest answer is yes. But not the way you might expect. I don't replay conversations anymore. I don't imagine what I would say if I ran into them. I don't carry speeches in my head or arguments I wish I had made. That part of me is quiet now. I think of them the way you think of a storm that passed through and left damage behind. You remember it because it changed the landscape, not because you want it to come back. They tried to reach out again after everything settled. Not to reconcile exactly. More to relieve themselves of guilt, to rewrite the ending in a way that felt softer. I didn't give them that, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Forgiveness doesn't always require access. Sometimes it requires boundaries. Sometimes it means releasing people from your life entirely so you can move forward without carrying their weight. I forgave them for myself. I didn't invite them back. The strangest part of all of this is how little the money factors into my day-to-day thoughts now. It solved problems, yes. It removed fear. It created options. But it didn't give me meaning. Meaning came from something else entirely. It came from remembering the nights I walked home exhausted, wondering if anyone would notice if I stopped trying. It came from the humiliation of wearing a uniform that made people look through me. It came from the choice to keep showing up anyway. I didn't survive because of what was in my blood. I survived because I refused to quit when quitting would have been easier. The night I lay in that emergency room bed, bleeding and invisible, I had nothing. No marriage, no career, no certainty. I was ready to accept that my life had peaked and everything ahead of me would be smaller. I was wrong, not because of billions or inheritances or powerful names, but because I underestimated endurance. If you're listening to this right now and you feel like your life has been erased, I want you to hear me clearly. Being at the bottom does not mean you are finished. It means you are stripped down to what matters. You don't need a miracle to survive what you're in. You don't need someone to rescue you. You need to keep showing up for your own life, even when no one else is watching. I know what it feels like to be told, in words or actions, that you don't matter. I know what it feels like to be betrayed by the people you trusted most. I know what it feels like to work through the night and wonder if the struggle is worth it. It is. Not because of what you might gain someday, but because your dignity is built in those moments when no one is applauding. My story didn't end when my sister told me to enjoy poverty. It didn't end when my career was destroyed. It didn't end when I was scrubbing floors wondering how I got there. It began when I decided not to disappear. If this story reached you, if any part of it made you stop and reflect on your own journey, I invite you to do something simple. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which moment stayed with you the longest. I read them, and I don't take them for granted. If you believe in quiet strength, in dignity, in the idea that people can rise without becoming bitter, give this story a like. It helps more than you realize. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about resilience, justice, and finding your way back to yourself when everything falls apart, subscribe and turn on notifications. You're always welcome here. Thank you for staying until the end. Your story isn't over. Not yet.